talk during 45 minutes. We're going to open up a Q&A session then, and then we're going to listen to Evelyn Forget. She is an economist and a professor in the School of Medicine of the Manitoba University in Canada and director of the Manitoba Research Data Center and researcher and the Manitoba Policy Center. He recovered all the data of Canada in the 70s and did this analysis. So we're going to start then with Jurgen. Good afternoon to you all. It is nap time, so we are all very quiet. It is a pleasure to participate in this very important event and very well organized about a very important subject about this universal basic income pilot scheme in Catalonia. And 10 years ago, I was living in Barcelona, and to me, I am very happy to have the opportunity to visit this city again and to meet old friends again, with meeting Sergi and David Casas and also younger friends. It's not only seniors I'm meeting this time today. I'm going to do this presentation in English, so please use a headset if you need them.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about this question. How do we know when a basic income pilot works? Okay, and in a way, it's a little bit of a trick question, actually, because my answer is going to be something along the lines of, it depends, and maybe we don't really know. But what I want to do today is show you that, one, it's actually a really important question, and two, explain and show you some of the complications in trying to figure this one out, actually. Okay? So I should say that this is based on some work I'm doing with Joe Crisp from the University of Bath. Joe isn't here today. And it's still very, very preliminary work. So you're going to get some arguments and suggestions, but we're still doing a lot of work around this. So this is very early days, but I hope it'll be interesting. And I think it will follow up very nicely to especially Bruce's talk this morning for everyone who was here. So this is really also about the politics and questions around that. So if we want to answer this question, like how do we know when a basic income works? There's actually three answers. Now, if I were to ask people here in the room, and if you ask people who work on basic income, most of them actually give you the first two answers, or one of the first two answers. And I'm going to try and explain that the third one is actually really, really important. So the first question, or the first answer rather, is that a basic income pilot or an experiment works when it is implemented effectively and in accordance with the design. So the idea is, we all get together, we plan this experiment, we really think very carefully, we put this all on paper, and then we have to put it in practice. And that is easier said than done. Now, there's many people here in the room that know this, so I don't have to elaborate on it. And I think tomorrow there will be actually panels on this, right? There will be panel on design and implementation. But it is important to realize that when we're talking about pilots and experiments and policies in general, there's a big, big difference between doing it on paper and doing it in practice. So the reality is that as soon as you start implementing something, you always come across problems, you always have hurdles and pitfalls, and you have to find solutions and so on and so forth. And the idea here of this first response is the sort of the minimal version, is to say, well, a basic income pilot works when the implementation is fine. You know, when the implementation doesn't cause any major sort of problems, it basically works the way we had designed it, then we're all happy. That is a very minimal sense of a basic income working. So the second answer is already a bit more involved. The second answer basically is to look at the results. So this isn't just about implementation. This is about okay, we put forward an experiment, we put forward a pilot, we design it, we implement it, and then we want to have results that are valid, that are reliable, that are also relevant. And they have to give us insights that inform us of how a basic income policy is going to work if we implement the policy. Now, one of the biggest lines of criticism in a lot of the pilots and experiments is that, in a way, we're measuring something, but it's not really a basic income. I mean, you've heard this all before, right? So this is one of the big debates. Again, I know tomorrow there will be an evaluation session, so I imagine people will be talking about that more as well, right? I want to move on to the third one, the third answer. And the third answer, I think, is something that's really missing in the debate. So part of my job, I think, is try to convince you that we have to take this much more seriously. And this is about policy impact. So this is to say that a basic income pilot or a basic income experiment works when it actually leads to concrete policy development, when it gives us something that we can say, actually, a basic income is somehow being implemented, right? Something like a basic income is being put forward at the level of policy. That's very different from just saying it's properly implemented. That's very different from saying we have good results. This is about linking the experiment to the policy process, to the politics of it, right? And this, of course, is part of what Brew was talking about this morning as well. So that, I think, is the really important answer. And it's one that's really missing. I mean, if you look at the debate around basic income and around basic income experiments, people often talk about policy impact, but we don't have any real systematic research. We don't have any real systematic analysis. We don't actually really systematically understand how basic income experiments feed into the policy process. You know, how did this happen in the Netherlands? How did this happen in Finland? How did it happen in Barcelona? How will it happen in Catalonia or in Spain, and so on and so forth, right? We have some ideas, but we don't have a real systematic sense of how this is happening. We spend a lot of time talking about design and implementation and evaluation. We don't spend as much time talking about policy impact, right? And in a way, this is strange, right? Because at the end of the day, I think most of us, people who are involved in basic income experiments, are in it partly at least because they do want to see some change, right? And it's true that in a way, so you can think of this as a continuum. Let me just explain it through this slide. You can think of it as, you know, a continuum of how you should think about policy impact. So on the one side, the one extreme is what I call the minimalist view, the scientific view. These are the people who basically say, policy impact doesn't matter. This is all about the science, right? It's hardcore science. We just want to do an experiment because we want to know this stuff. We want to know what effect it has. We'll write journal articles, we'll write reports and books, and we'll discuss this. And if nothing happens in the policy, then that's just a different thing. We're in it for the science, okay? I mean, to be honest, I don't think there's people really in that corner, right? That's a very extreme corner. I don't think there's people who really say we don't care that this happens at all. But what you do find a lot is people who actually say, we're okay with the policy side of it, but the science takes priority. We're not going to compromise anything on the science, right, for the policy. And in a way, for example, this is partly what happened in Finland. In Finland, they very much had an orientation of we really, really need to focus on the research side. We have to get the research right, right? And the policy side, of course, always comes in because, you know, politics is there and it's not going away. But there was a very, very strong attempt from the research team there and the implementation team to really keep it about the science, okay? What is the problem with that? Well, the obvious problem with that is that, as I said before, is that most of us really do want to see this change, right? It's very important. If you think about the coalitions of people, the groups, the different groups that have been running experiments in different countries, whether this is governments or whether this is stakeholders or whether this is activists. There's different types of scenarios there. But in each of these coalitions, there's at least always some people who are really in there because of the policy change, right? So to think that policy change doesn't matter just makes no sense. It doesn't describe the reality, right? So there's the other side, so sort of what I call the maximalist or the radical view. And this is basically that, a basic income pilot and experiment has to lead to basic income. If basic income doesn't follow, if at the end of the pilot, a couple of years later, we don't have basic income, then it has failed, right? And these are the people, there's a bunch of these people around. They are the people complaining about all these experiments, right? They're basically saying, why are we doing this? Finland did an experiment 2018, we evaluated it, nothing happened. Why do we bother? Netherlands, same thing. Canada, Ontario even got interrupted. Scotland never happened. Now Ireland is going to do an experiment. Wales is going to do an experiment. Catalonia is going to do one. Why are we doing this, right? If it doesn't immediately get us to basic income, why do we care about this? What's wrong with these people? I mean, these people think that policy really, really matters. And it does, right? But what's wrong with it is that they have a very, very limited view on what policy impact is. They basically think that it's black and white. This is either basic income or nothing, right? And that, again, doesn't describe reality. Policy development is all about stages. A lot of this is steps and stepping stones. A lot of this is incremental changes over time. Different types of processes. We have legislation, we have implementation. In one of the presentations earlier, I forget the name of the gentleman from Ivalois, he described the policy process, right? He had this slide with the circles. So we're talking about that stuff, okay? If you take the policy process seriously, then you actually have to take the view that policy impact is really, really important, but we have to look much broader. We need a much more subtle, a much more comprehensive sense of how policy works. And we need to start thinking really, really very carefully and trying to figure out what happens when we have a policy experiment, a policy pilot, a basic income pilot, and the different ways in which you can interact with different aspects of the policy process, right? That's the view, I call it the common sense view. That's the view where all the smart people should be, right? This is the, the view in the middle is always the easy one, right? We get away from the extremes. That's where you're at, okay? So how do we fit that in? So if you think about the basic income experiments planning process, basically what people are focusing on mostly is the middle tree, right? People are always talking about design, implementation, evaluation. Tomorrow, that's exactly what you have, right? That's your structure of a theme. And of course, it's really, really important. So design, we want to know what's the best experimental design to pilot the basic income. That's not an easy question. That takes a lot of discussion, right? A lot of discussion, a lot of very, very careful planning. It will be very different from one country to another, right? And at the same time, we want to learn from other designs and so on and so forth. It's very complicated. Implementation, same story, right? Very different from one country to another. Why? Because countries have very different structures, right? Different policy structures to start with that you have to fit it in. Making implementation fit, design, again, we need a lot of planning, we need a lot of discussion, we need a lot of experts involved. The same with evaluation. A lot of questions around what are the things that we want to measure, how do we want to measure them, and so on and so forth. So these things are very, very important. The first one is something that is not necessarily at the core, but that usually does pop up once you start planning, because people start realizing that in order to answer the questions around design, implementation, and evaluation, you actually should have a good idea of why you want to do a basic income experiment, right? And it's not enough to say, because I like basic income. That's not enough of a reason. I mean, there's a lot of different ways in which you can answer this question. So for example, in Wales, they basically trying to do it with care leavers, partly because they identified them as a vulnerable group. The same with Ireland. I think it's also part of the story that they want to do something different, right? So And in a way, the motivation thing here is very, very important because that will feed back into your design, implementation, evaluation. I put between brackets this question because around the motivation, you then also have the question, do we need the experiments? But we've already had that discussion this morning, right? I think it's partly a fake question, but it's one that keeps popping up all the time, right? But the one I want to focus on for a moment here is there should be a fifth step. For me, part of the planning process should be to have a step that says, okay, we need to discuss policy impact. How do we ensure that the basic income experiment itself is properly integrated in the policy process? How do we make sure that when this pilot is finished, when it's run, when it's evaluated, that things don't just stop, right? Again, Finland, great example, I mean, pilot was run. People still being very confused about this, by the way. People still think that the Finnish government canceled the pilot. That's not the case. The pilot was always planned for 2 years. It ran for 2 years. It was evaluated. But by that time, there was just no linking into the policy process. There was also a new government. They were doing different things, right? So that pilot project sits there. Olli Kangas and some people wrote a very, very nice book, which I recommend. It's a very, very good read. But this is what we have. We have reports. We have some journal articles. We have a book. There's not much of a discussion at the moment in Finland around basic income at all, right? So clearly something went wrong, right? And something easily goes wrong with basic income experiments and pilots. And it's partly because people don't realize that this is part of your planning process, right? You need to think now about how do you going to have this thing fit into the policy process? What are you going to do later on? And one of the reasons why you have to think about it now, because some of the decisions you make now will have an impact. Let me give you again an example from Finland. The Finnish team decided that in order to safeguard the science, that they were going to disconnect the experiment from any public involvement. There was no media attention. There was no sort of engagement. The idea was that this experiment would run for 2 years on its own, isolated, and then we would pick it back in. But that's a missed opportunity, right? That's a missed opportunity because at the same time, we could have had involvement with community groups, with movements, with government, keep the interest alive. So what happened in Finland, the government moved on in a very different direction, and the experiment did just run on its own, but there was no connection, right? So if you know that in advance that this is a problem, then you can start planning for it, right? So I've always argued, for the Finnish case, that they should have relaxed on the science, the hardcore science view there, and keep the involvement with the policy debate. We might have seen another result, who knows, right? But those are decisions you have to make now, not in 2 years or 3 years, okay? So this so far is about why this stuff matters. So what I want to do now is give you a bit of a sense of, okay, how do we start now thinking about this? I mean, we basically need two different things, but they're related. One, we sort of need a framework or a model of how to think about policy impact, basic income policy impact and the policy process. And secondly, we sort of need data. We need case studies, if you like, and we need an analysis, empirical analysis of that. How am I doing on time, actually? Sorry? Oh, good. That's good. Okay. So I want to get 3 quick complicating factors out of the way, and then we get into how the actual model looks, so to speak. The 3 complicating factors are when, where, and who. So what is the when? If you think about a policy, if you decide whether a policy has become a success or a failure, what is the time frame of that? I mean, are we thinking tomorrow, next year, in 2 years, in 10 years, in 20 years, right? There's a lot of examples of policies that started going really, really bad and suddenly became very successful in 20 years later. Or the other way around, policies that, that we thought were very, very successful And suddenly, you know, it turns out that it was all a big mistake, but we only find out in 30 years, so to speak. So time frame matters. And actually, this applies to pilots as well. And, you know, the famous case, I think, is Mincom. And, you know, we have Evelyn Forget talking after me. So the Mincom experiment in Canada, you know, 4 decades ago, was basically run, and then no one bothered doing the evaluation, and the boxes were put aside, and, you know, this whole disappeared until Evelyn dug it up, did the analysis. And now this experiment is kind of part of our story again, right? So this is decades after. This experiment now suddenly matters. It matters in the Canadian discussion. It matters in different countries, right? So this happens, but it's unpredictable. I mean, you know, there's no way we can account for, you know, taking something into account, you know, 2-3 decades from now. So in terms of time frame, what I would propose is think about 1 or 2 election cycles. I mean, think about the time frame as a political time frame. If within 2 election cycles, we don't get a positive result from a basic income experiment, we can say that, you know, that it went wrong. Why? Because basically anyone in government who was really interested, any sort of policy entrepreneurs, stakeholders, who would really be interested in using this, they would have done that already. After 2 election cycles, we don't know. But of course, during these election cycles, that means, you know, our evaluation can change, right? Because it may be that the first couple of years we don't see anything, and then we do see something, right? So that's one point about the when, is that we have to have a bit of a dynamic view. You know, we don't decide now and then that's forever. You know, policy evaluation just changes. Where exactly do we figure out success and failure? So the obvious example is that, you know, if you run a pilot in Catalonia, we basically want to evaluate whether it had an effect in Catalonia. And that is the proposal in a way, you know, it's the most straightforward thing. But it's important to realize that these things do have effects outside. So at the moment, for example, Finland is dead for basic income. The Finnish experiment on Finnish grounds, so to speak, on Finnish soil is dead. But for example, I was talking to people in Australia a few weeks ago, and they basically said that the Finnish experiment really kicked their debate on. Right? In Australia at the moment, people are having a basic income debate because of the Finnish experiment. So it is important. On the one hand, we want to evaluate in the country that runs it, that makes the most sense. But, you know, it is a small world, right? These things do move around. There is such a thing as, you know, policy transfers, policy emulation. That stuff moves around all the time. So it's something to keep in mind. Third thing, complicating factor, who gets to decide? So there's a lot of different people in different positions. You have the government, you have stakeholders, trade unions, business, civil society, you name it. You have basic income advocates, people who are really, really into basic income. You have basic income opponents. So who gets to decide what is the perspective, right? I mean, they have very, very different perspectives of what is a successful pilot, so to speak. So the proposal here is that we adopt a presumption in favor of basic income policy development. So the idea basically is that, well, we're just going to score things in terms of whether it actually has an impact, a positive income on basic income policy development. That doesn't mean that if something didn't happen, that that's a bad thing per se. I mean, there may be good reasons why something didn't happen. For example, if it turns out, I don't believe this, but if it turns out that your Catalan pilot gives really, really bad results, you know, I mean, imagine that it somehow increases child poverty. I don't think that's going to happen, but if that's what you find, then that's probably a good reason to say, hold on, guys, right? So although we score things positively on this line, so to speak, that doesn't mean that it's a bad or a good thing per se. We just need sort of a way to chart this. Okay, so then how do we start building this model? So this is starting unpacking this idea of the policy process a bit. So building on some literature of policy evaluation, we can distinguish 3 different types, if you like. Call them process, program, and politics. They're like 3 different dimensions, 3 different locations, 3 different areas in which an experiment can have an impact. Process is about, in a way, producing insight in effects functioning of basic income. You know, this is about the models, but it's not just about producing the evidence. It's also about disseminating the results, having a proper discussion amongst experts, the general public, all that sort of stuff. So it's not just producing evidence, it's also making sure that that evidence actually filters into the policy domain, right? Which is a very different thing. So it's not just science in a strict sense. This is the full-on knowledge production side. Then the program. Program is about implementing actual policy changes, but it's not about actually having a full basic income. It could also be about having some changes in the system that go in the direction of a basic income. It could be about having stepping stones, right? It could be about having some administrative changes that just make it easier later on to build the basic income. For example, in the Finnish case, you know, there's sort of a complicated layer of social security at the basis. What they actually ended up doing over the years is that they sort of equalized the levels of payments. And they also made them all individualized. So, you know, in a way, you almost have something like a partial basic income because it's individual and it's all the same level, although people can be in different programs, right? So that's already building up towards, but this happened before the experiment, so I have nothing to do with the experiment. It's just an example, right? And then the third angle, very important, is politics. This is about raising awareness and support for basic income in the general public. But it's also about securing real support, not cheap support, not sort of politicians just saying, I like basic income. This is about getting strong commitment from politicians, stakeholders. It's also great if you can actually change people's mind. You know, a good example is trade unions who used to be against and now become in favor because of the experiment. That's a win on the politics side, right? It doesn't mean that we have a basic income, but it's an important step, if you like, right? So we have process, knowledge production, we have program, actual policy change, and we have politics, which is all about coalition building and so on and so forth. So we have these types of impact, process, program, politics, and then in a way, we have different scales. So what we propose is this, and then, you know, this is not scientific, right? This is just sort of intuitive, trying to get something that gives you a bit of an illustration, right? So we have something between 0 and 1, where 1 is the largest, sort of the full impact. You know, you go like full on. Neutral impact, no change whatsoever, is 0. In between, we have something we call minimal impact. You have a little bit of change, and something we call significant impact, which is a lot of change, but not full on. And then we have a negative one. Why? Because initially, actually, we just had 0 to 1, which is what all the scientists do, right? Everything goes 0 to 1. And then we realized, actually, basic income experiments can have really counterproductive results. I think Brew mentioned this as well this morning. So we also want to have a negative sense. So then we can start running through this, right? The process side is about knowledge production. So on negative impact, process means very confused knowledge, no insight, and so on. So people basically, you know, a lot of conspiracy theory, a lot of misinformation. People basically end up understanding basic income less than they did before. One of the problems with the experiments, again in Finland, is that, you know, people report about it, there's clickbait, everyone just sort of, you know, doesn't even bother reading it. There's a title, it gets shared on Twitter and Facebook. Before you know it, there's a lot of misinformation, right? That can be a bad thing. Dealing with that is a problem. But then we can go on, you know, no real insights, a bit of insight, good quality. And then at the end, of course, we have the sort of high quality, reliable knowledge, properly translatable, good discussions, and so on and so forth. So you have a range. And you can do the same with policy implementation. Again, this one, negative impact on the program, policy implementation that goes in the wrong direction. Again, this is what happened in Finland. In Finland now, well, actually, the latest government changed it again, but immediately after the experiment, they had increased sanctions, goes the different direction from basic income, right? So you can have programs that become more targeted or more sanctions, it goes in the wrong way. And again, no changes, small changes, significant changes. For example, things that are not quite the basic income, but start mimicking it, right? So for example, in some countries, several countries with the pandemic now, they've basically taken away the sanctions, right? So it's like the sanctions are still there, but they're not implemented, for example. So that could be that type of change. And then, of course, full impact is something like an actual basic income policy. And then the same with the politics, right? So on the negative side, we can have public and political actors becoming more hostile. And then it goes no change, small increase in support, significant increase. And then at the end is a situation where we have a very strong coalition, right? Big public support, real public support, strong coalitions, maybe across ideological lines, parties from the left and the right, trade unions, business, everyone wants basic income, kumbaya. This is the great thing. Again, on this side, this is politics. So we don't have a basic income yet, but we have a situation where, in a sense, it makes it easier to build the basic income later on. So that's important. So we need to acknowledge that if an experiment gets you to that, that's a win. That's the point, right? It doesn't have to give you a basic income right away, but if we can measure this, then that is something that we can say that's a policy impact, okay? So what does that look like? So we did a little kind of game thing here. So these are, well, it's not a game, but it's sort of this. So this is, again, this is not science. This is to illustrate, and it's a bit subjective. And I should say in advance, especially on the Spain thing, I mean, we could argue with the people here whether we have the right interpretation, and we're perfectly happy to say that, we want to have that discussion and we need to revise this and have better indicators and so on and so forth. But here is what this could look like. So we have your 4 European countries, right? Scotland, Finland, Netherlands, Spain. Of course, Scotland never did a basic income. But interestingly, what we find in Scotland is that although the basic income never happened, so we don't have actual knowledge. And in fact, we probably have negative knowledge because the report, in a way, recommended things that we think at least don't always make sense. So we scored this as being negative on the process side, on the knowledge side. What we actually find is that the process of doing that feasibility study, even if the actual experiment didn't happen, generated political coalition, more political will, more political support, and actually also generated some identifiable policy changes. So Scotland is an example where they actually relaxed, for example, some of the things around sanctions and some of the programs that they made them less targeted and stuff. It's fairly minimal, so it's just a plus, not a double plus, but it's a start. And this all happened as part of the discussion around the basic income experiments. So that's very interesting. You don't need to have the actual experiments in order to already potentially see some impact, right? Then Finland, Finland basically did very well on the knowledge side, if you like, they did the science and so on. But then, the politics is dead. And, as I mentioned before, in terms of actual policy changes, they went in the wrong direction, right? So Finland at the moment, not looking too great. Netherlands, we scored them, sort of okay, as in some insights on the knowledge thing. Why only a plus and not a double plus? Partly to do with the fact that, there's some discussion about how much this really tells us about basic income. There's a bit of debate around that. A lot of them were really small studies and so on and so forth. In terms of the politics, we see a little bit of improvement. In the Netherlands, before the pilot discussion started, there was a lot of hostility towards basic income. And initially in these experiments, there was no reference to basic income. They call them trust experiments. They call them experiments with low regulation. This was a deliberate effort to try and keep the basic income politics away. Now, after all the experiment and the evaluation stuff happened, what we actually see is, if you look at the Netherlands now, is there's actually quite a bit of engagement and debate going on right now. right? So that's interesting. Then Spain, you know, BIM-INCOM, we scored it again, same, you know, some interesting insights, but a lot of complications with BIM-INCOM being very, very complicated and small groups and so on and so forth. It looks to us that it seems to have had some politics impact. I mean, I think the Catalan pilot now is evidence of that, right? And we actually score it high on the policy stream, partly because, you know, I mean, there's some sort of sense that maybe the experiment could have had an impact on your minimum income that was implemented, which is, of course, a very, very big thing. Now, I know that that's controversial, right? I mean, many people will disagree with me on that. And that's fine. I mean, this, again, this is not meant to be us telling you that's what it is. This is actually meant to give you a bit of an illustration of what you can do when you have a scheme and you have case studies. And there's some interesting things here. The first thing that I think is interesting is that it looks like these three different levels, you know, the process and the politics and the program are sort of independent almost. I mean, you know, they don't follow a very specific pattern here. So that's interesting in a way, right? You would have imagined that they somehow link, but it turns out to be not necessarily. And what you also see is that you have very different profiles, right? Every country seems to have a very different profile. It's very interesting to then look at the details and say, why is that the case? You know, what explains Scotland having this program, Finland having that program, right? It's also interesting that we just have this variety. Now, this is not a competition, right? This is not the Eurovision Song Festival. You know, you don't get to win anything. It's just that, you know, every country is a competition with its own country trying to get the policy, right? So, but what that already shows is that there's something going on here that we need to dig into. What am I doing for time? I actually have only one more slide after this, actually two. So the next stage of this, so we have sort of a framework, if you like. We can look at cases and start building some profiles, right? And then from there, the really interesting question is, what is driving all this, right? And, you know, and again, we sort of have a lot of people doing anecdotal stuff. You know, people are sort of talking about, oh yeah, you know, in Netherlands, it's a bit of this, and in Finland, it's a bit of that. But what's really, really interesting, and of course, the countries are all very, very different, right? I mean, Catalonia is not Scotland, is not Finland, is not Netherlands. But it is really interesting to see, nevertheless, can we find some common denominators there, right? You know, we haven't done the work on this. Basically, this is where we need to do a proper project now, right? By the way, if the Catalan government has any spare money, me and Joe are available. It's no problem at all. We have a lot of ideas. But these are the sort of things we can start looking into, right? So we sort of put them in different categories. The what is about anything related to the actual experimental design or the implementation, right? Things like, what is the scale and the ambition of the pilot? Are we talking about the full pilot policy evaluation, or are we talking about, you know, these sort of mechanism experiments where, you know, you take something that doesn't necessarily look like a full pilot, but you focus on one very, very specific mechanism? Are we talking about the pure BISC income, or are we talking about a complex experiment with a lot of co-interventions? I mean, BIM-INCOM had a lot of different things going on, right? So are we talking about RCTs versus demonstration projects? You know, projects that are called experiment, but are not necessarily having much of an actual experimental design, right? What about the framing? I mean, are we talking about deliberative framing of BISC income or actually avoiding it, like the case in the Netherlands? So we think that these are relevant factors to try and investigate to see whether some of these explain. Then there's sort of political or actor-centered ones. So is the experiment leader-driven, or are we talking about broad coalition? Is this, in Finland, for example, is one government, right? Much to surprise of everyone, including all the BISC income advocates in Finland, when the government there came up with, you know, in 2015, with a one line in the government program, which said, you know, we're going to experiment with BISC income. Everyone was like, what? You know, no one had any idea that this was going to happen. And in other cases, it's a strong coalition. You know, it's government and social movement and civil society and basic income groups and so on and so forth, right? So Catalonia here seems to be much more of the coalition side, right? So are we talking top-down versus bottom-up approaches? Is this government doing it, or is it really society pushing? Very, very different type of scenario. Are we talking about a scenario with strong or weak partisanship? What do we mean by that is, are we talking about basic income pilots getting caught up into politics, actual party politics, or is it, you know, in a way we relax the politics and we just kind of want to work with it, right? Interesting scenario, again, Finnish example. When Finland was proposing its experiment, the real basic income supporters were in opposition, right? So the interesting thing of the Finnish experiment was that the coalition that proposed it had one party that sort of was in support, but not support, like a bit mild. And then two parties that were, you know, skeptical or really hostile. And the two parties that traditionally are really, really pushing for basic income, they were in opposition. It creates a really interesting dynamic, right? So is there a pre-existing basic income community, or are we actually having to build one, right? So, I mean, of course, I mean, Catalonia, as you know, I mean, I know from my days when living here 10 years ago, I mean, Renta Básica has been pushing things since the last century, literally, you know, been going around for ages. But then in other countries, the experiment actually is part of building a whole movement. In the United States, for example, until very recently, I mean, you know, there was only US big and nothing much happening. And now suddenly there's so many groups there, right? It's crazy. So the same in the United Kingdom, the Basic Income Lab network, you know, is something that actually initially followed from Scotland. And then from there, it just, now I think they have 30 or 40 networks, right? Labs. Is there opposition from key veto players? Trade unions, for example. I mean, are trade unions sort of skeptical, but they say, yeah, whatever? Or are they really, no, we're not having this. We're really going to put our foot down, right? Big difference. But this is all actor-centered. And then we're talking about institutions and structural factors, right? What about the existing social security system? How generous is it? How is it designed? In Finland, as I mentioned before, we already have this sort of basic security level that already looks a bit like a basic income. Very, very different from, say, a country like France, where everything is, you know, is sort of dual labor markets and everything is sort of very, very pillarized, if you like, right? So very important different thing. Role of social partners. I mean, you know, can government basically just impose everything, or are we talking about a country where it's really important to have the business community and the trade unions on board, right? Very different things. Power distribution across different levels of government. So, you know, local level, regional, national, EU. Scotland is a very good case. I mean, in Scotland, they were doing all this talk of doing a basic income experiment, knowing fully well that the UK had all the powers, right? The legal power to run an experiment was not Scotland, it was the UK. And the UK run by the Conservative government was never going to do it, right? That's a complication, right? I don't know how the situation is in Catalonia, but I imagine, you know, you're going to have interactions with powers at Spanish level and so on and so forth. So that is stuff you need to figure out, right? So, but that matters. So, and then the electoral system, big important factor. I mean, are we talking about coalition politics, or are we talking, you know, sort of UK style, very oppositional, you know, one party, other party, boom, right? Very different things. So here is the interesting, I mean, they're all questions that we can start examining, right? And we examine them by looking at the cases in detail, but by doing comparative research as well. We want to really, it's the comparative thing that allows us to get some insight. So here is an interesting thing, and then I'll just go to the conclusion and I'll be done. The institutional side, that's pretty much fixed, right? It's really, really hard to change structures and institutions. You're not going to change your welfare state when you run a basic income pilot, right? You're not going to change your electoral system and so on and so forth. So in a way, you can basically just use that as a given. It's something you have to work with. It's going to constrain you. These guys, you know, más o menos, right? I mean, some of this stuff you might be able to engage with, to change, to amend, to interact with, but it's going to create a lot of hard work. I mean, these are serious players, if you like. It's going to take a lot of hard work to do this. This one, that's up to you, right? When you're planning a basic income experiment, that's the thing where you really make all your decisions. Of course, keeping in mind that all this other stuff plays around as well, right? So when we want to explore what is driving policy impact, it is important to know whether it's a lot of the design or it's a lot of the hard constraints, right? So this is the stuff we need to know. And we don't, not really, right? At the moment, we really have no idea. So what are the lessons? That's my last slide. Very briefly, I think there's a couple of lessons for planners. First, policy impact matters. You need to take it seriously. Don't just, yeah, policy impact, blah, blah, blah. No. This is real stuff, right? Not just talk. Be serious about it. Take it seriously. You need to do these discussions now, not in 3 months. It's too late. Oh, sorry, not in 3 years. It's too late. 3 months might, well, 3 months will be fine. 6 months is a problem. But you know, the sooner the better, right? So don't think that this is the final stage. All of these things matter now. You have to learn from other experiments, not just, you know, when you look at what's happening in Finland, don't just look at the design or the implementation or the evaluation. Look at the policy side and the policy impact side as well, right? So, you know, so you learn from the other cases by examining these cases. Look at the hurdles, the pitfalls, the possible solutions, and so on and so forth. You need to invest in this. If you want to take this seriously, it's going to cost you some money. You need to basically put some people, expert power into this as well, right? And of course, that's always the hard choice. I mean, you know, how much are you going to spend on design versus implementation versus evaluation? And now there's this policy stuff coming in as well. But I think it's important, right? But it means, yeah, think about that in budgetary terms. And then so all of these, in a way, are sort of some lessons for the planners. And then there's a more general point. I think all of us who are interested in basic income research and debate, we need to really look much, much more systematically into this whole policy impact thing. So we need to talk about different models. Joe and I built up a framework, but that's one framework, right? Maybe there's a lot of better ones out there, you know, that's fine. But people need to start doing that, you know, need to really start thinking, what does it mean to have policy impact? Could be different things. We need to think about indicators. We need to think about how do we measure this stuff? You know, what is it that we really need to look at? Joe and I were kind of doing a bit, you know, this one, I mean, it's great, right? I mean, I couldn't sleep last night, so I did a little bit of that stuff, a little color stuff, but, you know, but we need proper indicators, right? Okay, we need proper measurements. And then we need to look at country case studies, but really look at them in depth. This is going to take some work, right? So this is sort of stuff that PhD students do, for example, right? This is a couple of years really look at cases. I have some of those, looking at a few countries. And then we also need, as I said, I think we really need to also do the comparative research in order to establish the patterns and the drivers and stuff, right? So that's basically, as far as I'm concerned, that's the start of a new research agenda, because as far as I know, we don't have that. And I think it's really, really important. That's it. That's all I have. Yeah.
So thank you very much for this very thought-provoking presentation. I think we now have about 7 minutes if really stick to the timing, but maybe we can have an extra 5 minutes because we started late for questions and answers.
Si no hablas rápido, podemos hacerlo en español.
Ah.
If you don't speak very fast, I can understand Spanish.
Catalán también, pero
In Catalan also I understand.
nada. Oh. My ideas are so powerful.
Ah, okay.
Nada?
Bueno,
No?
doncs
Gracias, Jurgen. La verdad es que ha sido una presentación muy buena que nos ayuda a mapear, digamos, cómo
Thank you for
evaluar
this presentation that helps us how to map and think about experiments. And now you just have given this for examples, Finland, the Netherlands, Scotland, and Spain. Are you going to do that for policies, for example, in the case of Iran or Brazil? Or did you only consider that for these four countries? I will answer in English.
I totally forgot, but this is going to be a contribution to a special issue of a journal on policy impact in European basic income experiments. And actually, Leire is contributing a chapter on Spain, BIM income, and Heikki, who will be here tomorrow, is doing Finland. And we have people doing Scotland and Ireland and Netherlands as well, and then a couple of comparative chapters, and Joe and I are doing a framework chapter. And this special issue is the European Journal of Social Security, and it's coming out, I think, in September or October or something like that. We'll also have people who are going to the BN Congress will have a debate at the BN Congress around all this with the different contributors and stuff as well. But that explains why. So we're only, I mean, I'm looking at these cases because it's sort of part of this paper that's meant to look at using some European stuff, basically. But you're absolutely right. I mean, there's no reason, once we do this, there's no reason to stop, and we can, I should just say one more thing. There's a really interesting stuff about Europe, European cases, because, you know, Europe really has some common institutional and historical kind of type of background, which, you know, when you start bringing in Marika or Iran, change is radically different, right? So in Europe, I think Europe is sort of a really interesting, there's some similarities and there's a lot of diversity, which allows us to do really, really interesting things, okay? But sure, let's add more cases. I mean, Canada, you name it, right? So.
Jurgen, una de las cosas que has
Jürgen,
dicho
one of the things that you said that I think was interesting is that after these pilot tests, in some cases, this was useful to improve the existing policies. It might be, but we don't know. In some of the pilot plans that have been organized since the 60s, what are the evidences that we have? Of course, we know that the basic income hasn't been implemented, but the social policies have improved. Well, I don't know because I would need to research on that, but it is really interesting also to research on the cases, the historical cases. So we can learn a lot to see, for example, what happened with income in the United States and other countries. But actually, we don't have so much. The basic income experiments are quite recent. They started 10 years ago, more or less. So
te quería preguntar sobre la
I wanted to ask you about the criticism to basic income experiments, the fact of participants knowing that they will end. So the fact that the participants are aware that this basic income will be short in time, how can this impact on the results? Are the results really realistic? Because it can't be compared to when the basic income is there to stay forever. So do you think that this has an impact on the results? Well, actually, I don't know how to answer to this because this is a very different question. I mean, I'm not sure if I'm understanding you correctly.
I will try in English.
Yeah, sure, cool.
So the thing that some critics say about pilot plans is that since the people that are participating in them know that the basic income is going to end, it's
going to have an impact.
Yeah, like for 1 year or 2 years or whatever. What implications do these have in order to the persons that develop pilot plans to say if they have a real impact or not in a future real basic income?
Right. Sure. I mean, so the reason why I say it's a very, very different question, because this is part of how you design basic incomes and so on and so forth, right? So I mean, I'll say two things about that. One, I mean, there is a really interesting debate about the right timeline for a basic income, right? So, and we know that in general, everyone always says it would be so much better if we do longer basic incomes and so on and so forth. So I always tell people the opposite. And here is why, because I like to think about this as politics. So in that sense, it does relate to this issue, because election cycles is 4 or 5 years, right, in most countries. So one of the things that can happen is that if things are not sorted within an election cycle, everything goes. And Ontario is a very good example of that, right? There was a new government and they just canceled everything. So there is a good argument to make sure that in order to ensure that the basic income in a way is, the basic income experiment, the pilot, is protected as much as possible, we may have to only stick to 2 years, because it takes a year to plan and there's 2 years to run it and there's a year to evaluate it, and that's about it, right? I mean, and you know, so, and the first year of a government could be just deciding on it and so on and so forth. So that is an issue. Yes, it is a problem in the sense that, you know, people who only know that they have 2 years of a basic income, they're not going to change their lives and behave in the way you do with a real basic income. But neither will they with 3 years or 4 years. I mean, the sort of changes that we often think about, like the radical transformative changes, they're not going to happen with 3 years or 4 years either. That's why it's interesting. I mean, Bru was mentioning Marica a few times. And when in the morning discussion, I told Bru, I said, Marica is a policy. And this is why it's important, because in Marica, there's no time limit, right? That thing exists, and the people who have it, I mean, unless like every policy, governments can always change things, but in principle, it's not a project, it's a policy. So it is interesting to look at what results they come up with, right? Okay. But there's a lot of these design questions that you have to think about. And yes, I mean, you're right. I mean, in a sense, the link to the politics is important, but you know, but how that really plays into securing policy impact can be a lot more closer. I mean, I don't have any evidence, so to speak, to say that a 2-year project is performing better or worse than a 3-year project. I mean, as I said, I mean, this is very preliminary. We're just thinking about the framework and about how to do this. The actual research on this still has to happen. So I can't give you any evidence, so to speak, right? So. Is that an answer to your question? Yes. Okay.
Jurgen, conoces muchos experimentos y planes.
So you know a lot of pilot projects and experiments. And the approach of the pilot test of doing it in communities, in small regions, as in Catalonia, seems to me a very interesting one than others that were done in a random way. I would say yes.
Well, I'm going to do it in English. I'm too jet lagged to explain. Porque mi cabeza es en Valdivia, en Chile, de verdad. Okay, so there are problems. So there are interesting things around doing, you know, an RTC, but you know, I mean, people like, I mean, Evelyn, for example, I don't know whether she will talk about this, but Evelyn's been talking a lot about some of the differences between, you know, saturation studies. David Kalnitsky, who is another Canadian who does really, really interesting work, you know, has written a lot on the difference between these two and also sort of favors, you know, sort of this idea that we need to start looking at community level engagement, etc. I will tell you another reason why I'm very worried about RCT versions. This again comes from the Finnish example. So what happened in Finland, as you know, 2,000 people were selected, randomly selected out of 200,000 who were fitting certain criteria. What did that mean? That means you had 100 people in Helsinki, 80 people in Tampere, and then you go north to Finland and there'd be like one guy there and 2 people there. And so one of the things that happened is when you think about the implementation, so Kela, which is like the sort of the security agency there, they have offices in all the things. So these are the people who are paying out the payments, right? These are also the people who are paying out the social assistance and the basic employment and some child subsidies and so on. So if you have a basic income and you're in Helsinki and you go to the office, these people know how it works because they've been trained and they've been given all this information, and they have 100 people, so they know how it works. But the people up in the north, they have 1 or 2 guys or 5 or 10, and they have no idea. They don't know how to do this. And it costs too much money to train all these social, you know, social implementers, so to speak, all the caseworkers, to train them in all these remote places and so on and so forth. So my biggest worry is that actually the Finnish pilot results are seriously misleading because we seem to have anecdotal evidence, and we're looking into this. I have a PhD student who's doing a paper on this now, trying to look into this. There's a serious worry that people with a basic income would come to the office and the officers basically just say, look, you need to apply for employment and this and that. You need to go through the system. You need to apply for this. And they were actually treated like they were in the normal system. So they had a basic income, but they still had to go through all the bureaucracy and the administration and the sanction stuff. And they were told that, look, if you don't apply for jobs, we're going to take this away. And this is wrong. But the people didn't know it. The people who got the basic income don't know it. And the people who had to deal with them don't know it because no one had, I mean, they might have gotten a letter, but that's it, right? And they get 100 letters a day, so to speak, right? So what's the difference? If you do a community-based program, you can invest and you can train people, and you have much more sort of dedicated spaces. You can handle that implementation problem, right? So that's an argument, I think, why, you know, working with specific areas may be an advantage. So. Am I explaining myself? Okay, okay, good. ¿Algo más?
So, oh, there's one more question.
Gracias. Yo quería hacer una pregunta. En todos
I
los
would like to ask you, in all the cases in these experiments,
¿cómo ha sido la comunicación?
how was the education or the communication, social education, apart from analyzing the case? Because sometimes I'm scared that it's going to be only in the academia, so to say, very technical things, and the creators of public policies, but actually it wants to be a universal policy, so we should universalize these discussion, the results and the experiences. And I don't know how this was done. You talked about motivation, you talked about the process.
Este parte del proceso no es solo.
This is why it's not only producing studies, it's also disseminating and discussing. It's not enough just writing a book or an article or in a magazine or whatever. It's fantastic for the academia, and only 5 people can read it and understand it. No, it's not like this. The most important thing is that in this part of the process, we need to give scientific results, and we also need to invest in a communication system for the society, and the contact between the science and the society is really important to establish this link, because this part is going to establish a link with the policy. And if people know what is basic income and how this pilot scheme works, and it's better. Very important. We cannot provide translation if she's not using the microphone. I'm terribly sorry.
Claro. Sí, sí. No, claro. Sí. No, es muy importante, muy importante.
Yeah, sure, that's very important.
Vale, muy bien. Pues lo dejamos aquí porque ya nos estamos.
Well, let's stop there because we are behind the schedule.
So now we give the floor to Evelyn Forget. You have for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have the series of the Q&A session.
Thank you very much. I am delighted to be joining you this morning. I was asked to address some of the political aspects of pilots, and I suspect that's because I have the unique advantage of living in a country that has managed to have 2 very large, politically driven basic income pilots seriously compromised by political factors. And so the question is there anything to learn from the Canadian experience? Anything that might help with pilots going forward? So let me tell you a little bit about our experiments and some of the things that have happened and some of the lessons I've drawn from that. In the mid-1970s, Canada had a very large census announced in February 1974. Families received support for 3 fiscal years between 1975 and 1978. In 1979, when the researchers returned to the government and said, okay, we've collected all of this data, now we need some funding to complete the analysis and tell you what happened, they were turned down and they were told to archive the data for possible future analysis. So the project didn't end early. It continued for the full planned period, but a tremendous number of things happened politically and economically and socially between the time the experiment was first conceived and planned, then announced, then implemented, and finally ended and analyzed. Over that decade, there were a couple of oil price shocks. The economy went through a period of very high unemployment and high inflation. Society itself was changing dramatically in the 1970s all around the project. So divorce rates were soaring, women were entering the labor force in large numbers for the first time. And all of this made things very unstable politically and socially in Canada. So it was a time of social unrest. And that meant that governments paid the price. Governments changed at the provincial level, at the federal level. And new governments, it turns out, have little sympathy for the special projects of their predecessors. So new governments come in, they're a little bit less committed to what their predecessors thought were important priorities. So the priorities of the government changed dramatically between the beginning of the 1970s. Canada entered the decade with great confidence, and it entered the decade intent on addressing the problem of persistent poverty. That was the purpose. By 1978, we had a rather battered country that was too busy trying to deal with the economic and social changes of the decade to even focus on poverty. In 1970, we cared about poverty. By 1978, we'd seen interest rates soar to 18 or 20%, and we saw middle-class families unable to pay their mortgages and losing their homes. So the government, it turned out, by the end of the decade, was much more concerned with the fallout for middle-class and upper middle-class voters than they were for the people who would benefit most from a basic income. And so my first point is that experiments take a really, really long time. Even a 2-year experiment takes a very long time from the point when they're first being talked about and conceived through the vicissitudes of implementation to the time when the data is finally collected and analyzed. And yet in politics, a week is a really, really long time. If you're talking about a decade, it might as well be a century. It's a very long time. Priorities of all kinds, political, social, economic priorities change, and they change a lot. And that has tremendous implications for a pilot. Whatever the political preoccupations at the start of the project, you can almost guarantee they're not going to be top of mind by the time your project ends, by the time you get to the analysis. And so you'd think with that behind us, Canada might have learned something. And then we did almost exactly the same thing just a couple of years ago. In February 2017, the largest province in Canada, Ontario, announced a basic income pilot. Participants were selected and they were registered, and some began to receive the payment. But it turned out that this experiment was implemented in the very last year of a very unpopular government. So the last participant was registered in March 2018. Just 2 months later, there was a provincial election. The government changed. In the run-up to the election, all the parties had promised to continue the pilot to collect the data. But just a month after the election, the government canceled the basic income pilot, and they canceled it in a particularly brutal way. Participants, people who were part of the project, were not informed of the closure directly. They heard about it on the radio, they read about it on Twitter, they saw it in the newspaper, but they had no idea what was going to happen to them, what was going to happen to the money they'd been promised and had begun to receive. Many had made commitments in their own lives and changes in their own lives and were in very difficult situations. In August, so 3 months after the election, participants were told that the payments would continue until the following March. The research team was disbanded, the pilot was ended, no scientific analysis was possible. There was a follow-up survey, but it had a very low response rate. But nevertheless, it seemed to show all the benefits you would have expected. So what I'd like to do today, the purpose of my little talk today, is to ask whether there are any lessons we can learn from the kinds of things that happened in Canada and the sorts of things that I would do differently if I were moving ahead. I think the first lesson is one I can't emphasize enough, and that is you need to get the money up front. The researchers have got to get commitments up front. The research cannot rely on governments to continue to increase, to enhance, or to facilitate the project. You got to get everything you need from the government before you even begin to recruit. You've got to set up the project team independently of the government in every way you can. So you've got to do your utmost to protect the pilot from political changes, from the political winds. And in particular, you never want to be in a position where you're asking a politician to make a decision to facilitate the pilot, to allow it to continue. So the pilot, in a sense, has got to be kept out of active decision-making. It can't be part of that process. And that allows the pilot to continue with or without government support. So if you think about Mincome, for example, it was able to continue to the end because until they needed the money to analyze the results at the end, they were actually quite separate from government decision-making, political decision-making. In Ontario, by contrast, it was reliant on ongoing government decision-making. But I think that there are a lot of other things to learn, and most of them are about communication. They're about the relationships between experimental participants and researchers, the general public, civil servants, politicians. And some of this builds, I think, on what Jurgen talked about just a few minutes ago. It's about sharing the design and responsibility for the pilot with everyone involved. Researchers really aren't on their own here. They require buy-in from a lot of different groups if the pilot's going to be completed, if it's going to generate any useful data and ultimately lead to any change in social policies. So I'd like to talk about some of these different groups and things that perhaps could be dealt with a little bit differently. And the first group I'd like to talk about are civil servants, government employees who are involved with delivering existing programs. These guys know a lot, and more importantly, they control information. They control the data. Civil servants can actively undermine the project from the inside, and they can do that by creating information flows with managers, with politicians that share incorrect or partial data and interpretations. They can block data access required by researchers. They can take excessive amounts of time to produce data. They can insist that the data can't be produced, or it's inconsistent with departmental policies, or it requires legal opinions or court orders, or it costs too much to produce data that's necessary. It's not enough to say, to have the politicians say to you, we support this project and you'll get the information you need. You actually need the active involvement of civil servants who are on board with the project, who see this as an important investment of time and energy. If these sort of intermediate level civil servants are not part of the project team, I think that's a huge error. It would mean that they have no interest in the success of the project, and some will even see the project as an imposition of unnecessary work or as a threat. And it's not enough to have the managers on board. The managers were on board in Ontario. The midline civil servants were not. In Ontario, the managers who were tasked with overseeing the project spent much of their time going to conferences and talking about it, but they didn't spend a lot of time ensuring the project team actually had the materials that they needed. So the first lesson then, before the project even starts, is to think really, really carefully about your research team and to make sure that you have the right people on that team. Civil servants should be among the directors of the project. And I don't mean upper level civil servants, in the Canadian case, assistant deputy ministers or other higher ups. People involved in actually delivering current programs need to be involved. I guess the second group of people I'd like to mention are political staff. And it's really important not to confuse the political staff with the civil servants. Political staff work for politicians. Our projects were always supported by politicians and by the political staff. They were dreamed up, in fact, by political staff. They were mandated by politicians, but political staff were challenging to deal with in all kinds of ways. Having these guys on site is essential, but they're potentially dangerous. It's really important that everyone understands that political staff are not civil servants. And in fact, they often have very tense relationships with civil servants. They have their role, but they're not nearly as useful as they claim to be. They need to be managed. More importantly, I think we have to talk about the people who are program participants and the people who could have been program participants but were not selected, either because you're running an RCT and they were assigned to control groups or for some other reason. Let me first talk about the program participants. And here I'm not suggesting that the participants should design the project or be involved in data collection or analysis. But I am suggesting that the researchers need to have direct involvement of potential participants to deal with practicalities of delivery and data collection and to highlight potential red flags. So just as an example of the latter, I want to talk about something that's a current matter of discussion among some of the people delivering small-scale pilots in the US right now. It's being talked about online on a regular basis. One of the political concerns that we often hear, especially in North America, associated with the basic income is that people are going to spend the money on drugs or alcohol. And the question that engendered a lot of discussion online is whether participants should undergo drug tests. And as you can imagine, drug tests are demeaning, they're unnecessary. This was never part of the Canadian experiments, and we shut down very quickly any attempt to talk about what people spent their money on. But the political reality is that to have a policy change, you need to address the fears of the population. So what do? In my opinion, this is the sort of thing where having an advisory group of participants, program participants, turns out to be tremendously important. It seems obvious to me that confronting participants with drug tests will make them angry, will make them feel unvalued. It's unnecessary and it's inconsistent. But I think that's the kind of question that needs to be addressed openly with potential participants so they know why data is being collected, why you're asking the kinds of questions you're asking, why they're being asked to produce data. So researchers cannot develop questionnaires and procedures without some sense of how participants are going to react. But participants can also play other really, really important roles. Researchers have their own goals and information, but participants also have priorities, and they have a lot of information that doesn't necessarily come to researchers. Their involvement can lead to minor changes in the way the program is designed and delivered that are tremendously important to them and not particularly costly to researchers. For example, one of the most important issues for many people on current disability supports in Canada is the monthly reconciliation of earned income and the adjustment of their benefits. These are income tested benefits, and people receive a monthly allotment of earnings before benefits are reduced, but these allowances are all calculated monthly. So if you accidentally exceed your monthly allowance, your benefits reduced, even if you earn nothing at all in the other 11 months of the year. Excuse me. This leads to massive fluctuations in monthly payments. Moreover, the process is really, really bureaucratic. So it's actually less work and doesn't cost very much at all for researchers to switch to quarterly or less frequent reconciliation. It stabilizes payments. Another example is the way the data is collected. In one small pilot that took place in Vancouver, and this pilot dealt with an unhoused population, and participants very much wanted cell phones to complete surveys. Researchers hesitated. They wondered whether the phones would be stolen or lost or sold, but in the end, they were talked into providing them. One of the side benefits of providing the cell phones was that they were able to supply a lot of useful information to participants through online apps about other benefits and how to access them. The cell phone company provided the phones for free. Free internet access was already widely available throughout the city. Researchers provided stripped down cell plans for participants. It turned out that the phones were a great hit. They were highly valued. They were closely guarded by participants, but most importantly, it made them feel valued, made them feel important, and it brought a lot of collaboration and a lot of positive interaction. So I think participants have a lot of information that researchers need to know about, and the relationship should be, I think, should be quite a close one. But we've also got that other group to deal with, and these are low-income people who are not chosen to participate. So depending on how you select your participants, you might be faced with people who could have been selected, but were instead allocated to a control group or simply not randomized to join the pilot. This is obviously not a problem if your project includes everyone who would be eligible in a demonstration project, for example, or a saturation site. But if you're doing a trial or a small pilot, this can be an issue. So how do you deal with the jealousy of those not receiving a basic income? Interestingly, this was not a problem in the Ontario pilot. The Ontario experiment was an RCT, randomized controlled trial in 2 of the sites, and half the people selected were assigned to a control group and received no basic income. They were, on the other hand, asked to complete a lot of surveys for which they received a small payment. So why wasn't there an outcry? A lot of advocates and a lot of researchers thought that there would be. And I think the reason for the success was the success of the methods used by researchers to introduce the project. This was always understood by everyone involved to be a project that might lead to a change in policy. So researchers held a lot of town halls. They explained over and over and over again to large community meetings why they designed the project the way they did, why they thought they needed a control group, the important scientific contribution, and in a sense, the important donation of people who were involved in the control group. Participants, non-participants, potential participants all bought into the notion that this was science, and they accepted that they had a social responsibility to contribute. It was an incredibly generous response, and it was an unexpected response. So it was a very positive thing to see that, but I think it was a direct result of the effort that was put into communication with everybody involved. So I think this high level of trust came about because the researchers were very good at including community members in the experiment. They didn't exclude them, they didn't talk down to them, and they didn't pander to every request that was made either. I mean, they made reasonable decisions and explained their decision-making to the people who were involved. Another group of people I'd like to talk about, how am I doing on time? Another group of people I'd like to talk about in terms of communication are the people out there in the community who are providing frontline services, charitable groups who deal with the population that you're focusing on. There are a lot of organizations out there who are involved in delivering services to the populations you're addressing. So these are groups like public health clinics, for example, food banks, and so on. And they can play a really, really important role in facilitating or blocking the project. They, in fact, can be either official or unofficial on-the-ground partners of the researchers in delivering this experiment. It's important that these service providers understand that a basic income is not an assault on the work they do. Basic income does not replace them. It will not replace them. But that actually everybody's on the same side. It's actually a welcome addition that will both help their clients and allow these groups to reallocate their own resources to the kind of work that they do best, that only they can do, in fact, providing voluntary programs that really make people's lives better. It takes a lot of time and effort to win the trust of busy frontline service providers. And it's absolutely, to my mind, essential that basic income researchers take that time and invest the time and the money to do it right. Representatives of these organizations need to be involved in the planning and delivery of the experiment. Positive statements from these organizations to potential participants go a very, very long way. But they're also a source of information out there in the community. They have very, very broad networks, and they can speak highly of the experiment or they can speak negatively of the experiment. And so their goodwill is tremendously important. Most of these organizations are working on really, really tight budgets, and they don't have the staff time to participate. So I want to suggest that a really good expenditure of some experimental money is to buy the time of staff members at key frontline service providers. And I can't emphasize that enough. You've got to pay for that time so that they can participate in research meetings as equals. This is a really small cost. If you think about the overall size of your budget, this is a really small part of it. And it has huge benefits. One thing we've found is that many of these organizations will hire our students, they'll hire our graduates to be the liaison. So our own students have found employment this way. They turn out to be the connection between these frontline organizations and the researchers. They're trusted by both parties. They're trusted by the people who hired them. They're trusted by us because we trained them. And it's really a route out there into communication in the broader community. They spend most of their time advocating with their employers for the pilot. It's a really, really beneficial investment. So this is a really, really good investment of time and money because these organizations can encourage the participation of blind clients. They can deal in the first instance with any difficulties that a participant might have. most importantly at all, they can speak well of the project. They can speak well of its researchers and its participants and all their interactions. And remember, all these organizations have interactions with governments, various levels of government, various agencies within the government, other agencies, and the public more generally. I think this is a really, really small price to pay for the goodwill it can generate. And I could go on, but I think my point in all of this is that politics, and I don't mean politics in terms of policy, as Jurgen was talking about it, but the sort of politics of running a project are a tremendously important part of having a successful project. And I think that part of that is managing communication flows, ensuring that people are treated with respect, ensuring that everybody involved or potentially involved in the experiment is treated with dignity. And rather than just go on and talk about all of these other groups, I'd just like to emphasize some of these key points that I've raised. First of all, I think communication's at the heart of a really successful social experiment. Time and money and energy needs to be devoted to communication with all of these groups. A huge amount of thought needs to go into the communication plan and into managing information flows. Secondly, everyone needs to recognize that an experiment is not researchers doing something to subjects. That hierarchy really needs to be challenged. A lot of thought and effort needs to be devoted to the design of the management team, who to include and for what purpose, who does what, and who's responsible for what. There need to be a lot of advisors who are kept in the loop constantly. Who's on your advisory teams? How do you communicate with your advisory teams? What information do they receive? Who has the right to know what, when? There need to be, I think that people need to be paid to manage communications, not only with, and I quote, the public or the media, but with all the stakeholders involved. Participants need to be involved. They need to feel appreciated. The relatively small gift of a cell phone, which actually made research easier, was incredibly highly valued. So I would devote a lot of time and a little bit of money to showing appreciation to controls if they're part of the design. But more importantly, everybody needs to be heard and to feel that their input is important, it's being taken seriously, people are doing what they can do. Fourth, just something that everybody knows, but I forget all the time, and that is you shouldn't confuse civil servants with political staff. That's a big mistake. You shouldn't believe political staff when they tell you that they can do something for you or deliver something. And you can't underestimate the importance of support from the civil service. And again, I'm not talking about high-level civil servants, the people who are nominally in charge of supporting your experiment, but rather the mid-level guys who know how the programs work. And fifth, and I can't say, don't ignore the frontline service providers who are out there trying to make the lives of your subjects easier. Although everybody's going to doubt it sometimes, you're all on the same side. If you can leverage support from these groups, it's very worthwhile. And I don't think you should ever hesitate to invest research funds to make that cooperation happen. And just to end this little talk on a particularly important note, don't forget to get the money up front. Don't forget to get your governments to commit everything you're going to need for the entire period of your experiment up front, and to allow you a certain freedom from the day-to-day politicking that can destroy and scuttle your experiment before it even begins. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Evelyn, for your speech. We're now going to open the Q&A. There's one question from the chat from Reynard Huss saying, well, it's a question about the impact of the power of stakeholders and essentially how basic income experiments and the results are used or not. So I don't know if you can present some examples on this.
The importance of stakeholders, meaning the importance of the results to the stakeholders, or the importance of the stakeholders in ensuring that the results are used to affect policy change?
I'm not really sure, to be honest.
Well, let me talk about the latter. I think that I think that I can speak about the Canadian experience. There are longstanding charitable organizations out there who have very well developed relationships with levels of government. They are trusted entities out there in political communication. So large food banks, for example. Now, I think we can all talk about the limitations of food banks. Nobody thinks a food bank is a reasonable way to deliver social programs. But these organizations have done a very good job of establishing themselves within the fabric of society. And so, encouraging support from people at all levels in this organization goes a long way towards ensuring that all politicians, when they're campaigning for the next election, hear about the importance of basic income. We now have a situation in Canada where some of the basic income groups are key supporters for a basic income going forward. It's taken a tremendous amount of work to convince people who like to talk about food security as though it has something to do with food rather than income. It's taken a lot of effort to convince people that the way to deal with food insecurity is to ensure that people have a reasonable amount of income security. But at this point, they've become our chief spokespeople. So people out there with high profiles in the charitable community who raise a lot of funding are now speaking very positively about basic income in the context of Canada. These are trusted people. And we can say the same thing, excuse me. Another group we have tremendous support with are public health providers, people who run clinics that are dedicated to treating particular marginalized groups in society. So sexual health clinics, for example, and so on, have always been great supporters of basic income. But again, some of these organizations have people who have a great deal of status with political decision makers and policy decision makers going forward. And it's not so much, it's both formal and informal. It's become almost routine to see these organizations write annual reports that talk about the importance of a basic income going forward. So it just becomes incidental. It's just part of their game plan now. And it's also informal when they talk to people. So it's part of their formal reports. It's also informal when they're talking to people who are making decisions. And we see it in funny ways. Very many people running for office, for example, just a couple of days ago, I had knocking on my door somebody who wanted to talk to me about why I should vote for him in an upcoming provincial election. And he spent a great deal of time telling me that basic income was a really important thing. And he was actually attracted to politics because of the importance of basic income, because of his organization. So I think, it's sort of these informal filaments out there in society that bring about social change. And I think that we need to be aware of how important people are, how important these communication lines are, and to think about how it is that we can leverage those lines of communication in order to change broader attitudes in society.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Can you hear me now, Evelyn?
I can hear you.
Okay,
I can hear you now. Yes.
Thanks for your talk. There is a couple of questions from the public. The first is whether the size of the communities or the places where the experiments were implemented had some influence on the communication of the experiment. Yeah. I mean, the communication in when civil servants or the researchers threaten or get in touch with the participant individuals. And related, perdó, en català, pel públic que està aquí. També amb el que acabes de dir ara, l'última frase, jo personalment...
Personally, I wanted to ask you whether the fact of the government stopping the experiment had any repercussion for the future, or do you think that this will have any repercussion in the future? For the future of basic income in Canada, and also for the future of the movement itself, for the basic income movement itself. Do you think that will have any impact?
Okay, let me talk about the size of the community first. All of our experiments have been organized in particular communities to represent larger entities. So the Ontario experiment took place in 3 towns in Ontario. So communication within the towns were fairly straightforward to manage. The researchers actually made partnerships with frontline service providers, people who were involved in running shelters, people who were involved in food delivery, public health clinics, legal clinics, and so on. We made partnerships, informal partnerships with these groups, and they helped us recruit clients. And they spoke very positively at their own meetings of the basic income experiment, and they helped build trust among potential participants in the experiment. So they were really invaluable. They were also valuable in getting people to complete the surveys and provide information, because in many cases they provided, in Ontario, in many cases they provided access to internet and access and help with literacy issues, in issues where they involved their translation and so on. So these groups were really important. And the fact that they were done in local communities certainly made the experiments easier to run. Excuse me. We were actually running this through the Ontario government though, which is a very large province. And so we also had to pivot from the communities to the provincial government and deal with the civil service in Toronto that was essentially keeping all of the data, controlling all of the data. And I'm not sure we did as good a job. In fact, I'm very sure we didn't do as good a job with the civil servants as we did with the community. We spent a lot of time and effort. Most of us are involved in community work in one way or another, so we know how to deal with community organizations. We're less adept, I think, at dealing with the complexities of politics and civil service. And I think that we were a bit naive in the way we dealt with those organizations. I think if an experiment were to be run again, I would certainly put a lot more effort into managing that. And there are certainly people out there who can do it better than we did it. And one of the things I would have done without question is to recruit thought leaders within the civil service to serve on the research team, to encourage them to be on our team before we even started. And I think that they would carry the word and help to bring things forward. You asked what the effect of the government ending the experiment early in Ontario, what impact that might have on the basic income movement and the idea of basic income. I guess I'm a little less convinced than Jurgen is about the relationship between experiments and policy change. When I look at what's happened in Canada, I think that political attitudes change over time, and I think they change quite independently of what's happening in the experiments. So in a sense, the basic income experiment is always riding on the wave of changing political expectations. The government that was elected was a very right-wing government in Ontario. And we have a first past the post system in Canada. So we get these big changes from left to right when things happen. So I think that wasn't a particular change. That government is now coming up for re-election. It's been in power for, I think, 5 years now. So there is an election this June and it's expected to win again. The government has softened somewhat from its early days. It's taken a much less hard stance on curtailing social programs. And it actually did quite a good job during the pandemic. So I suspect that that will be very positive. And I think that except for the people who were directly involved, most of the population has now forgotten about the basic income experiment in Ontario. In terms of the movement, I think it galvanized support for the movement, and it encouraged some of the transitions that have occurred among civil society organizations, some of the unions coming on board, for example, and many of the charitable organizations coming on board to support basic income, because there's a recognition that it's not just the experiment and cancellation of the experiment. It was the subsequent pandemic and the recognition that our existing programs are just not adequate going forward. The changes have to be made. So I'm not sure it'll have a negative impact going ahead. I think that basic income faces challenges going ahead that you all know about, of course, and that aren't different in Canada than they are anywhere else. But I don't think that cancellation itself will be negative. One thing I do worry about a little bit, and I'm not sure it's a negative thing, I think there's going to be a lot more hesitation about running an experiment in Canada going forward, especially one designed like a randomized controlled trial. There is certainly talk in some of the provinces. I'm involved with a group in PEI who are planning to do what they're calling a pilot, but they see as an implementation of a policy. It'll be a province-wide pilot, so to speak. So I think there will be a change in the kind of experiments that take place, and the notion that people would be recruited and then dumped off the pilot because a politician changed his mind is just not something that's going to be acceptable going forward.
Sorry, but we are not hearing the room.
Sí. Hola, Evelyn.
Hello, Evelyn. As you might know, all around the world, the impacts of the pandemic have had many effects. One of them is in the field of mental health. I remember some years ago, I read your research papers about the decrease in hospital incomes after the income pilot plan. And I was profoundly impressed when I saw how important it was to have an income, and even in the hospital context. So that was one of the things. I was writing my PhD on mental health and basic income, and to me, that was one of the evidences, one of the most important and interesting evidences that I can remember of, next to others in California. So I would like you to please elaborate on some of those evidences that you found back then.
Yeah, thank you. Those are very kind words. My first formal work on basic income actually was a reanalysis of some of the income data that was collected in the 1970s. I was interested in, I'm a health economist, and I was interested in whether or not the pilot led to better health outcomes. And so I went looking for the data, and I ultimately found it. But more importantly, Canada had just introduced universal health insurance before the income pilot was put in place. So I was able to access the Medicare database to look at interactions between individuals and the healthcare sector in Manitoba. It was the experiment in the town of Dauphin was a saturation site, and it was a guaranteed income experiment. So it was income tested, but it did provide some of the other benefits of a basic income, the reduction in conditionality and so on. What I was able to do was to create a series of artificial controls, if you want, for every participant in Dauphin, and to compare results for the Dauphin subjects who received basic income and counterparts in other similar kinds of places, same age, same sex, living in similar kinds of families, to see what the impact was. And my major finding in terms of healthcare was an 8.5% reduction in hospitalization for people who received that guaranteed income relative to a set of matched controls. When I looked more carefully at the results to find out why that was the case, mental health played a huge role in the reduction in hospitalizations. So I think mental health it turns out to be rather important. And when I was able to track down some of the participants to talk to people, I think, we certainly received anecdotal evidence that in fact was changing people's lives. The increase in security made a huge difference. First of all, in terms of how people felt, but secondarily in terms of, family interaction. There was a reduction in violence, for example, and so on. All, I think, associated with better material prospects during that particular period. To my mind, I've always been particularly interested in health outcomes. I guess a secondary result of that was that we found an increase in high school completion rates. It wasn't typical for low-income children to finish high school before the experiment came along. When the experiment came along, we saw a real boost in high school completion rates. And so education would have been improved during that period. And again, if you think about long-term implications on things like health, mental health, that's a tremendously important input into it. So yeah, that was important, and it certainly influenced subsequent experiments. I think it's rather routine to now be collecting data on health outcomes for participants in the experiment.
M'aixeco perquè m'han dit que m'he d'aixecar, no perquè em vulgui fer veure massa més.
I stand because I was told to be standing. Okay, so I have a question for Evelyn, and in a way, it has to do with some things that Jurgen said before. There is one thing that, actually, I am so happy to be here listening to those very interesting presentations. But I'd like to see this moderate optimism about the possibility that basic income pilot scheme can have an influence on conditionated programs. Of course, what we want is that the pilot scheme is spectacular and that we can implement basic income. But if we consider a suboptimal scenario, would be to have this kind of positive effect on conditionated programs, that we can reduce their conditionalities. The we didn't understand lab strategy, but my question is, under which conditions, according to your experience, under which conditions this might be the case? Because you are now talking about many civil servants and social workers that are aware that things would be better like this, and that they push forward. But here in our country, we have been for many years, for example, people in the social work field saying that things aren't working well, that income conditioned models don't work. And on the other hand, so on the one hand, we have social workers, but then we also have the framework of the politicians themselves, those that introduce those policies. In the case of Spain, we have a minister that introduced this model after the pandemics, saying that that was for the very poor people, strictly for the very poor people. So I would like to see to what extent there can be those positive filtrations. In case we don't get the final victory, that's what we want, but in case we don't get that final victory, how? Which would be the conditions for that positive filtrations to succeed, for a different mindset, because we are talking about this universal, not conditionated framework, but in some contexts, the mindset is very strict. So in academic terms, or in goodwill terms, I understand that people are convinced because facts show reality, but there are also other types of structural and institutional inertias, and I would like to know, and this is not a bad question. I mean, I'm so happy to observe this moderate optimism, but what do you think, and Jurgen also you can answer, what do you think are the optimal conditions so that we can have these potential positive effects with a basic income pilot scheme on the conditioned programs? Thank you.
I think that's a great question. I think that one of the results of the MINCOM project in the 1970s was a reduction in conditionality in Canadian social programs going forward. It depends what you compare us to, right? We tend to compare ourselves to the US. And if we compare ourselves to, which is an easy comparison, I got to say, but if we compare ourselves to the US, we do tend to have much less conditionality in terms of social programs. And people have traced that back directly to the MINCOM experiment. And I want to suggest that in some ways, those results come about as a compromise. Everybody sees the positive effects of the basic income experiment, and they react the way you expect them to react, which is, oh my God, this is too big a change. It's too big a change, and it's going to cost a lot of money, and we can't possibly do that. In a sense, what happens is that the reduction of conditionality in other programs comes about as a compromise. We're not going to go to a basic income, but maybe we'll make some changes to these programs just because we recognize that there are certain limitations. And it doesn't go far enough. Of course it doesn't, but it's a start. So I do see that kind of positive thing. And I'm seeing it in a sense in PEI as we're talking about a basic income. Can we afford it? Well, maybe we can't afford it, but what can we do? Well, we can maybe take another look at provincial social assistance, and maybe some of these things can change and we can talk about it. So, I mean, I think in some sense that becomes a natural consequence, at least it has in the Canadian context become a bit of a natural consequence. Now, not for everybody. I think that civil servants in particular tend to be very focused on the conditionality, both because of the costs of not making things conditional and because that's the way civil servants think. And so I think, again, I want to focus on that group as being tremendously important. But maybe I'll hand it over to Jurgen and see if he has more insight into how you bring about the policy changes.
I thought I was done working, but okay. I don't really have that much to add, apart from the fact that, I mean, I think what Evelyn is describing is a really, really interesting phenomenon. And in a sense, to kind of link it to the paper that I was presenting and, you know, the work that I'm sort of trying to do with Joe is, what would be really, really interesting is exactly look at different sort of cases and see whether we can sort of see similar movements happening, yes or no. And if so, is there anything that we can find that sort of explains that, right? So that's the sort of stuff that I'm partly interested in. Like we sort of hear a lot of little stories from the different sort of experiments. The thing that I'm really, really interested in a way, is to try and dig that just a bit deeper and say that, okay, let's now look at all these sort of cases. Is there anything that they have in common? Or is it really all sort of contextual and so on and so forth, right? So. But personally, I mean, I totally buy into this. The compromise thing, I think, is a really, really good point, right? So I think I totally buy into that. And I think we see something like that happening with the pandemic now as well, right? So we see a lot of programs and people are resisting. You know, I mean, parts of governments just want to go back to normal, and then there's been resistance in all sorts of ways. So what you will find is sort of acceptable type of compromises. And, you know, they're not full-on basic incomes and things like that, but they go in the right direction, if you like, right? So the question is whether this is something that sticks, right? That's one. I mean, is it going to stay or could it go back? And if it sticks, is it something that gets stuck or can we build on that? Those are the sort of questions that are really interesting. And I mean, you know, we're going to have to see, but because we don't really know what drives it, I think, or at least, you know, we also have sort of ideas, but we don't really know. That's why, in a way, it's all sort of a bit speculation, right? I mean, yeah. So.
Doncs res, si no hi ha més preguntes,
Okay, if you don't have any other questions, I understand that's the case. We close this session here because, yes, there are any other questions? Are we finished? Well, yes, I just wanted to thank Evelyn and Jurgen for your presentations. And
a big thank you to you for your work in helping to organize this workshop in the part of or on behalf of the people from the office and the organizers of the workshop.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Doncs moltes gràcies per haver vingut i us esperem.
Okay, thank you. And we see you tomorrow. Thank you. Evelyn and Jurgen, thank you so much.
Recording stopped.